All children need to be loved and protected from harm. It is everyone's responsibility to ensure that children are safe and that they receive care and encouragement. Primarily, this needs to come from their parents, family, and friends, but also others with whom they come into contact. This includes leaders and workers in schools, clubs, places of worship, and community groups. In fact, any organisation that they're part of or may visit. When a child is hurt or afraid, and perhaps can't turn to immediate family or friends, it is often to a leader of one of these organisations, a trusted adult, that they will turn for help. And it is essential that help is given correctly. Essential for all concerned, as we will see. What follows in this programme is an example of how workers and leaders in community groups, places of worship and faith communities can work safely with children, and not just children, but also adults who are unable to fully care for themselves. We demonstrate how to respond correctly where there is a suspicion or a report of abuse or harm to a child or vulnerable adult, and what can happen where this is not done. We are going to look at an example of where just such an incident was handled badly in the past, and how the organisation responsible learned from their mistakes and became a safe place for children. What you are going to see and hear is partly based on real life. The year is 2003. 3 members of the church's Child Protection Advisory Service are waiting for the director of their video production company to arrive at a lunchtime meeting. They're due to discuss the making of a new child protection DVD. While they wait, a mobile phone begins to ring. Expecting it to be the producer who has been delayed in traffic, David Pearson, CCPAS director, answers his phone. But the call is far more serious than any delay. It is the pastor of a large church with a very big problem. It appears that 10 years ago, a married couple who joined the church and led the Sunday school abused children in their care. One of these children, now an adult, has spoken out about the abuse she had suffered. It led to a court case and prosecution, and the judge has just issued his summary. The press have got hold of the story, and there is already a TV crew outside the church, and the current leader doesn't know what he should do or say. News is just coming in of the Miss X abuse case, where the defendants, Michael and Marjorie Smith, have been found guilty of a series of offences against children over the last 10 years. Following the revelations of Miss X, who cannot be named for legal reasons, it became clear that the church leader at the time, the Reverend Folds, failed to bring the abuse reported to him by Miss X to the attention of the authorities. His failure to act allowed the Smith couple to continue undetected for the next 10 years, resulting in the abuse of many more children. In his summing up, the judge, Mr. Justice Peer, slammed the church for negligence and incompetence in failing to alert the proper authorities. Our reporter is on the scene at the church at the moment.
He's refusing to come out and speak to us.
But it seems that the current leader, Jim Stapleford, is not available for comment. We will be bringing you more news and an in-depth report on child abuse in the church and similar organisations in our extended bulletin tomorrow lunchtime, Abuse Behind Closed Doors.
Well, at least the weather will be nice.
Okay,
Up
thanks
north.
everyone. Yeah, that's fine. So, just what went wrong? Let's take a look. 10 years ago, a young man and woman started attending the church. They were a pleasant and friendly couple who went out of their way to be helpful, and they attended all the services. They impressed the church leader with their enthusiasm, and when they told him that they had a calling for working with children, he was delighted. They couldn't have arrived at a better time as far as he was concerned, as the current Sunday school teacher was leaving, and they seemed to be an answer to prayer for him. He wouldn't have to try to encourage anyone else to take over. They could start immediately. Reverend Folds and the leadership of the organisation ran their church along traditional lines, which meant that they normally took the easiest option when making a decision. They had no policies or training on matters relating to children. Why should they? They'd never seen the need. Children had always been around, and there were certain ways of doing things that everyone liked and was comfortable with. It had been suggested that a more organised approach should be taken to recruiting workers, but the leadership saw this as interference by busybodies who didn't understand what good things the fellowship achieved without this. These were people who didn't understand their culture. Michael and Marjorie Smith were popular with the children, and no one saw any need to check on what they were doing. The children seemed quiet and well behaved, and there were some very nice pictures on the walls of the Sunday school room now. No one in the church supervised or managed workers. There was no need. Someone who was no longer around had suggested that there should perhaps be some training for children's workers, but that had been rejected as too time-consuming and inconvenient. Surely it was just a matter of looking after the children and making sure that they had fun. No one in the organisation had needed any training. All that was needed were people who liked children and had a gift for working with them. They just got on with the job they were given. It had always been like that. Anyway, the leaders had found that some people didn't like being told how to do their jobs, and the leaders liked to avoid conflict. Several months later, a 10-year-old girl, called Annie, spoke in desperation to the church leader, whom she had known all her life and trusted. She said that she had something important to tell him about her and her brother, and asked him if he would keep a secret. He said that of course he would. She said that her secret was very scary. She began telling him about things that were being done to her and her 8-year-old brother by Michael and Marjorie Smith, who ran the Sunday school. How she and her brother were invited to tea at the Smiths' house on a regular basis, and then things happened there which she didn't feel right about. She said that she'd been told not to say anything about it, and that if she did, she would be taken away from her mum and dad. But she knew how much it was upsetting her brother, and it was making her afraid. She was going to say more, but the Reverend Folds, who had been getting angrier and angrier as she spoke, interrupted her, told her to stop at once, and that he would not listen to such nonsense any more. He told Annie that she should not say such things. What she must mean was that they just played a bit roughly. She should have told them, and they would have stopped. Annie insisted that it wasn't like this, but he said that he was sure she was making it all up. He had never heard such wicked things said about such nice people. She was not to repeat the matter to anyone, and she should be ashamed of herself for telling lies. He was, of course, aware that some people did mistreat children, but he couldn't see that sort of thing happening in his church. He was arrogant enough to think that he could pick out a dangerous person just by looking at them. He then proceeded to talk to a number of other members of the leadership about what Annie had said, gossiping about it. And they all agreed with him, of course, agreeing and saying what bad parents she must have for her to say such things. This went on for a few days until one member of his organisation, a deacon, suggested that perhaps they should make the Smiths aware that Annie had been making such claims in case they heard about it and were embarrassed. Reverend Folds rather reluctantly agreed to visit the Smiths to let them know what had been said and to reassure them that he had full confidence in them. When he arrived at their house, they showed him in with smiles and handshakes and offered him tea. He told them what Annie had said and explained that he didn't want them embarrassed. To his amazement, they admitted that they had perhaps behaved a little foolishly, some silly games they'd made the children play that perhaps could have been misunderstood. Reverend Folds listened to what they had to say, which bore no relation to the truth, and at the end they asked him if he would forgive them. He said that of course he would, and he was sure they'd learned their lesson and would not do anything like this again. They assured him that it was the only time it had happened and they would never do it again. He told them that their secret was safe with him and all was well. A little later on, the deacon who had suggested that he talk with the Smiths said that his conscience had been troubling him and perhaps they should mention the matter to a friend of his who worked for the local social services. Reverend Folds flew in a rage at this and said there was nothing to report to anyone, and anyway the last thing they needed was some outside agency getting involved in matters they didn't understand. Besides, hadn't he given his personal assurance to the Smiths that the matter was closed? But what about Annie? What happened to her and her brother? Well, after her conversation with the Reverend Folds, she said no more for years. She now felt sure that what she had to say would never be believed. But at least she and her brother were never invited to the Smiths for tea again. Several weeks later, to everyone's surprise, the Smiths put their home up for sale and left the church in the area without a word. Members of the fellowship wondered what could have happened to them, but some new volunteers soon came forward offering to work with the children, and the Smiths were soon forgotten. But the effects of what they'd done, and would carry on doing, didn't go away, although they would not come to light for years. 10 years later, Annie, or Miss X as the papers call her, decided that she could not keep quiet any more about what had been done to her and her brother. She had had nightmares all her life. She was afraid to go out, and she had even fallen out with her parents, whom she secretly blamed for letting it happen. They could never understand why she had refused to attend the church anymore and would never set foot inside another place like that. Annie had been married for a short while, but she couldn't manage long-term relationships, and it ended in divorce. Her younger brother had been charged with a series of offences against other children, and he was sent to a secure unit, as he was still under 18. She decided she had had enough of living with the secret of what had been done to her and to him, and decided to speak out. But where to go, and who to tell? She plucked up courage and called her local social services office. They listened to her, and then a social worker and a specialist police officer visited her, and she told her story for the second time in her life. This time she was believed, and her claims were investigated. The police traced the couple who had carried out the abuse. Thanks to Annie's evidence and various unrelated incidents that had been reported over the last 20 years, the police arrested the couple. It turned out they were working at a church elsewhere and had been abusing children unchecked throughout the country for 20 years. It must have been many children. And that was when the newspapers got hold of the story and it became today's headline news. We cannot rewrite the past. Annie and her brother and the other children have been abused, their lives affected by what happened to them. But it didn't have to be like this. If the Smiths could have been stopped before it even started, Annie would be a different person, and her brother would not be in prison for repeating what had been done to him. Let's look again at what happened 10 years ago and compare it with what should have been done. To do so, we're going to return to the same church where the incident originally happened and see how the current leader and leadership manage and protect the children in the face of the very same threat. Remember how the Smith couple approached the Reverend Folds to work with children? Well, a few weeks back, a similar couple applied to the current leader, Jim Stapleford, to work with children. Imagine that they were undercover journalists who were looking for a story, sure that nothing would have changed, and they could prove how negligent such places are. Let's look at their meeting with Jim Stapleford as he interviews them and explains the safeguards that the organisation has in place now, completely unaware of who they really may be. The church now has a safeguarding policy. This sets out how they recruit, train, and manage workers within their organisation. It also sets out how they will communicate about and respond to concerns, how they will manage people who visit who are thought to pose a risk, and how they work with specialist outside agencies to keep members of the church of all ages safe. And what difference does this book on a shelf make? Well, of course, a book on a shelf makes no difference at all, but the church applies this policy every day in all that they do. They have a member of staff who is responsible for ensuring that everything is done properly and the authorities informed when or if necessary. This person is known as the Safeguarding Coordinator. Remember, Reverend Folds not only had no policy, he had not even cared to give it any thought. Even though he was aware bad things could happen to children, he had made no effort to educate himself about them, and he had thereby, effectively, ensured that the other leaders and workers had no knowledge of such matters either. The current leader, Jim Stapleford, has developed his awareness in the area of safeguarding. Not only his awareness, but that of every member of the church's leadership, including the trustees. Everyone knows where they can see the church's safeguarding policy. Everyone, the leaders, the trustees, the workers, even the cleaner. Everyone, parents, carers and visitors, are responsible to and accountable for each other. They are all aware that children are vulnerable and are careful who they allow to have access to children. Jim has organised some excellent training with the help of the Church's Child Protection Advisory Service, or CCPAS as they are known. This has enabled his workers to feel confident in working safely with children, and they know how to respond to any concerns that they may have or that a child may bring to them. The Reverend Folds and his workers had no knowledge of these matters whatsoever. In fact, he saw it as interfering. If only he had taken the trouble to find out more, he wouldn't have allowed unknown people to work with children, and he wouldn't have turned Annie away when she tried to talk to him. Let's remind ourselves of Reverend Folds' method of recruitment. The Smith couple said that they had experience with children. and without another thought, even though they were completely unknown, he accepted their offer and put them straight to work. Here, Jim Stapleford and the children's leader are interviewing this couple and referring to the application form that they've had to complete. They're very convincing. These journalists have done their research well, and they even drop the names of some very impressive organisations that they say they've worked with. Jim explains that the church has a safeguarding policy and that this is to ensure safe working for everyone within the organisation. He points out that they've only recently started coming, and he would not be able to consider their application until they both knew each other better, perhaps after they've been attending regularly for 6 months to a year. Then he would be very pleased to consider them for work with children, but they, just like he had, would have to have references taken and checked from previous organisations they'd worked with, and a criminal records disclosure check, and also register with the Independent Safeguarding Authority. Notice that Jim Stapleford can use himself as an example here, as every member of the leadership has been checked. Not only can the leadership be sure that they've taken every step they can to protect members of the organisation, but they also protect the church. They're not asking any new member to undergo a process that they have not been through too. With workers who were already in post, Jim had them fill out a simple application form and then was able to process the references just as he would for a new worker, including a criminal records disclosure check. If the Reverend Folds had been operating a policy like this when he was interviewing the Smiths, it is very unlikely that they would have been willing to wait for 6 months or a year and then have to give references and apply for a criminal records disclosure check. They would have left his office there and then and looked for an easier target. Annie and her brother would have been safe. One of the biggest obstacles to introducing a new policy can be people's preconceived ideas. The best form of leadership is leading by example. And therefore, Jim Stapleford, when he introduced this to his organisation, made sure that he, the trustees, and the leaders of the organisation were made to appreciate the need for safeguarding. They appointed a trusted and specially checked member of the leadership as safeguarding coordinator, with responsibility for taking references and making sure all those working with children, and others such as trustees, have undergone a criminal records disclosure check for both paid and voluntary personnel. Jim arranged for the safeguarding coordinator to go on a specialist training course with the Church's Child Protection Advisory Service to ensure that they had the understanding and the tools to do the job properly. He was then able to announce this new initiative to all of the workers, explaining that he was not asking them to do anything that he and the leadership had themselves not done. He told them he was sure they would all agree that they wanted the world to know that kids are safe here. They would even use it as part of their community work project to encourage young people to take part in their activities and to show the community around them just how sincere they were in keeping children safe. They could show that they have a safe working practice. The children's workers and leadership now not only have a clear policy and guidelines for safe working, they also have a designated member of staff to help them with any safeguarding issues. All workers are properly checked, trained and supervised, and children's activities are properly organised and managed to ensure that they are kept safe. The safeguarding coordinator ensures that everyone works within the boundaries of the safeguarding policy. And what happened when Annie came to talk to the Reverend Folds? Well, his first mistake was to agree to keep a secret, without having any idea of what it was. Then he not only told her that he didn't believe her, he suggested that what she must mean was they just played a bit roughly. He tried to change her story, then stopped her from telling him any more, and finally accused her of making it all up. Jim and his leadership have great training, which has made them aware of how important it is to listen to children in the right way, to never make promises that they may not be able to keep, and to make sure that they listen carefully to what the child has said, however improbable or unpleasant it may seem. They know that they must not put their own thoughts or ideas into what a child says. They also realise that they're not qualified to deal with these issues, which can be far wider ranging than they can realise, but that they need to take prompt action. They even have procedures for suspending a member of staff who has an accusation made against them, rather than running the risk of any further accusations or harm coming to children. Oh, and they also know how to keep such matters confidential and never to gossip. So how should we respond when a child, young person, or an adult at risk reveals something like this? Let's look at Reverend Folds again. How did he deal with it? He contradicted her, suggested alternatives, denied what she said, silenced her, accused her of lying, and was angry. He then went and told the Smiths about the accusation, effectively tipping them off and allowing them to leave the area undetected. How would Jim deal with it? And he has had to. He doesn't make promises that he might not be able to keep, like keeping a secret. He accepts what he hears without passing judgment and writes everything down as soon as possible after the conversation, including dates, names, and times. He tells the child what he is going to do next and immediately contacts the safeguarding coordinator. Very sensibly, he has appointed someone other than himself in this position. He is aware that as leader, he could have an accusation made about him. There is a deputy safeguarding coordinator as well, to cover when the main coordinator is not there. No one should ever mention an accusation to the accused, whoever they are or whatever their position in the organisation. Reverend Folds' way of responding to Annie's story was to gossip about it. However, Jim has built his house differently. In the case of suspected sexual abuse, or where there are signs that a child may have been deliberately harmed or is suffering from neglect, the safeguarding coordinator contacts Children's Services or the Police Child Abuse Investigation Unit. Jim took the trouble to make contact with Children's and Adult Social Services when he took over as leader of the church. He also went along to see the police to introduce himself and to tell them about the organisation and its work. This was quite unusual, and as a result, both the local police and social services hold the organisation in high regard and are willing to help them and work with them. And what about Annie and her brother? So often the child or children, the ones who have suffered the most hurt, are forgotten. Reverend Folds never spoke to her again. No one considered her welfare or her future, and their suspicions should surely have been aroused when the Smiths mysteriously moved away so suddenly. As is so often the case, both children continued to suffer because what had been done to them hadn't been dealt with properly. And in the brother's case, he went on to cause other children to suffer as well. It doesn't have to be like this. We managed to get Annie to talk to us about what had happened, and 10 years on, this is what she had to say.
When I was 10, my brother and I were abused by a man and woman at my church. And this man and woman abused us for nearly 6 months. There were other children from my Sunday school class who went there as well, but never at the same time as us. I didn't realise what they were doing to us was anything to do with sex. No one had really taught me anything about that, and it just seemed a bit funny. I found out that it wasn't right because of what a friend at school said, and I was really worried. I didn't want to talk to my parents about it at first because I thought they'd be angry with me for letting this happen to my brother and we might go into care. So I thought that I'd talk to someone else I trusted, but he wouldn't listen to me. He told me I was lying and that I was being naughty. After that, I didn't talk to anyone. I made my brother promise not to say anything as we'd just get into lots of trouble. The thing is, it spoilt everything. I couldn't get rid of the thoughts about what they'd done and why I'd let it happen, and it made me sad and angry. The next year, I went to a new school, but I didn't want to make any friends in case they found out what had happened, and then they wouldn't like me, so I was always lonely. And my brother? Well, he started doing the same things, but to other children. He was addicted to it and he couldn't stop. He got caught and now he's in prison, but he still didn't say anything about them, the people who did it to him. In the end, I thought no one else knows me or cares about me, so what does it matter if they find out about me? So I talked to social services, and they did help me. They helped me talk to a special police officer, and it meant they caught them. Our Sunday school teachers. Some teachers they were. They're in prison now, and I thought that perhaps it would help my brother, but I doubt it. The thing is, it doesn't make the memories go away. That's what ruined my marriage. It only lasted 3 months. Everything's been ruined because of them.
Jim and his organisation recognise they need to show care and compassion. They have people available to offer support and care and to respond to the needs of survivors of abuse. Jim recognises that some people need specialist help and support which he and his organisation cannot give, but he knows where such help is available. At each step of the recruitment and management process, the harm to Annie and her brother could have been avoided. Here, at the initial meeting, someone who wants to harm children would realise that this is not an easy environment for them to get close to children, and they would therefore probably look for an organisation that was not so vigilant. Here, where references are required, again this would be a process that they might want to avoid. And here, with training and supervision of all workers, even people who look after or clean the premises. And why the caretaker or cleaner? Well, children, particularly lonely ones, might well make friends with them, or go to them for help. A joint watchfulness and care makes it harder for bad things to go undetected. And here, where a child tells a trusted adult who has been properly trained, even when the worst has happened, the proper authorities can be involved. Even if it doesn't lead to a conviction, it can help in the protection of hundreds of other children. It may well form part of the jigsaw puzzle that will ensure that they are caught, or stopped, next time they try to work with children. We place a lot of emphasis on working with the proper authorities. It's because this is part of their role, and they have specialists working throughout the country who have extensive experience in dealing with these matters. Sad to say, they see it every day. Reverend Folds thought that he could discern a sex offender, or indeed any person who might threaten children or adults who could be at risk. Many people think that they know or can sense who such people are. Well, there is a reliable way to find out what such a person looks like. Look in a mirror any mirror. That's right. They look just like you, and just like me. No telltale marks, odd clothes, strange expressions or unusual behaviour. The fact is, you cannot tell. If you can't tell who may pose a risk to children, it means that you have to rely on a sound safeguarding policy to protect children from anyone who has not been properly recruited and trained. This way, only adults who have passed a series of thorough checks and who are properly supervised have access to children. Without this simple process, the lives of children, their families, and the future of your organisation can be so easily destroyed. CCPAS is aware that in some places half of sex offenders known to the authorities attend a place of worship. Some of them genuinely want to change, but others see such organisations as easy targets. They also go to the shops, workplaces, social centres. They go where everyone else goes. Nowhere is safe without a safeguarding policy. A study by Huddersfield University in 2008 found that people who abuse children are not just men. In fact, only about 38% are lone males, 12% are lone females, 26% are organised groups, and the remaining 24% are children or young people themselves. And it's not just strangers, but more often family members or family friends, people who have won the trust of children. One of the advantages of building relationships with the specialist units within your local police and social services, including the local Safeguarding Children Board, is that they may be able to inform you if someone attending your organisation is a risk to children, if they know about it. However, they cannot always do this, and you must work on the basis that you will never have any warning, as the fact remains that most offenders have not been caught. You therefore need to ensure that all members of your organisation are aware of your policy for protecting children, and they should thank you for it. Because you have clear policies in place, any member of or visitor to your organisation will be unlikely to be able to cause harm to children. And what about problems that have arisen outside the organisation? For example, where a child is being harmed in their home environment or where they're not being cared for properly. It is a fact that most abuse occurs within the family, not in organisations. Well, they can receive proper support from you because your organisation notices these things and you listen to children, and you bring concerns to the attention of the specialist children's services where necessary. Forgiveness and acceptance of people, whatever their past, is an important aspect of many faith groups, and we're certainly not suggesting that you should publicly identify or exclude a sex offender from a place of worship. However, as with wisdom you would never put a reformed drug addict in charge of a chemist's shop, so you would never put a supposedly reformed child offender in charge of children. Such offences are often addictive, and given the opportunity, will be repeated, however repentant the individual may appear to be. The Bible says, "Go and sin no more." Responsible leaders don't put people back in situations where they may face the same temptations. Instead, they offer proper pastoral support. It is essential that all organisations have strong policies in place to supervise anyone who has committed or been accused of violent or sexual acts against children. You cannot afford to take chances or hope that a person is reformed or will act with respect. It really isn't worth the risk. CCPAS will be pleased to advise you how to manage offenders, So please contact them for help with this. You have to work in partnership with specialist authorities. It may seem obvious, but history has shown that many faith groups are reluctant to do so. This may be because of their experience with police and authorities in other countries, or experience with the police in this country when they were younger. But ask yourself, what is it you're doing that could be misunderstood? Perhaps some change is needed to your thinking or to your activities. If your building caught fire, would you have a meeting about it, or would you call the fire brigade? If your building's burgled, you call the police. If your teenage daughter comes to you and tells you she's been raped, you call the police. If a child is harmed, yes, just as with an adult, you call the police. If you don't, you are aiding the criminal and thereby become just as guilty as them. There is never any excuse for allowing a child or anyone who cannot protect themselves from suffering harm because you're not prepared to act. Evil flourishes when good people do nothing.
Consider how much you can give to your community if your church or organisation is actively prepared to work with schools, education, domestic violence counselling, pregnancy advice, debt management services and so on. And in all these areas you can ensure your safeguarding standards are effective, whatever the cultural tradition, belief or religious practice of those around you.
Although not suggested in the church that we have been considering, in some traditions it has been known for leaders and others to pray for children in a violent manner. Children have been told that they have a demon, that they are bad or evil. They have been shaken, struck and treated roughly, have had poisonous liquids such as bleach poured over them or been forced to drink it. In addition to being very frightened by these experiences, they may be convinced that they are indeed evil. To do this to a child is against the law in the UK. There are varied reasons for some leaders and others to accuse children of being possessed by evil spirits. It may be that the child's behaviour, speech, body, or appearance is different. Perhaps because of birth defect, chemical imbalance, poor diet, poor parenting, or home life. Families may also be the victims of misfortune, lack of opportunity, be financially poor, or lack permanent housing. Over the past years, police and social services have dealt with cases linked to places of worship, which have ranged from children being frightened to seriously assaulted and also murdered. The case of 8-year-old Victoria Climbier raises enormous issues for the Church. She died at the hands of her carers, eventually killed by her great-aunt and the aunt's boyfriend, who had both been torturing her for some time. In the subsequent inquiry, 3 churches with whom she was in contact in the weeks before her death were perceived to have failed her. In fact, only hours before she died, a church sent her home in a taxi. It was the taxi driver who made the decision to take her to hospital. It wasn't just the authorities who came in for criticism, it was also the churches. One newspaper at the time headlined the fact that pastors were praying demons out of her while she was dying. Make sure you don't have to learn the hard way, as these churches did. Children should be treated like children. If you have concerns about a child or adult who may be unable to speak out for themselves, please contact the police or social services. Let's not forget that it is important for children to learn about prayer and for them to be prayed for. This may be in the context of a family service where children are prayed for generally, or maybe where prayer is given specifically for individuals who ask for it. If a child's parent or carer brings a child for prayer, it's right that the child is consulted and agrees to it themselves, just as you would consult an adult who was brought to you. When you pray for a child, get down to their level, and if your tradition is one of laying a hand or hands on a child, explain this to them and make sure they understand and are comfortable with it. Only touch the child in a place that is acceptable: a hand, arm, head, or shoulders. Don't shout at them. Be gentle with them. In the Christian faith, we know that Jesus corrected his disciples for stopping children from coming to him, and when he prayed for them, he did it gently, with love and compassion. He even used children as an example, pointing out to the adults present the simple trust of their faith in him, and said that adults should be the same. When you pray for children, please be like him. No other behaviour is acceptable, either to him or to our society. Child abuse is a serious crime, and as we have seen, its consequences are far-reaching. If it is not dealt with properly, as with Annie and her brother, it goes on and on, affecting the lives of hundreds of other people if left unchecked. The safety and well-being of children must be a priority in your organisation. But how do you go about setting up a safeguarding policy? Well, unless you're part of a denomination with a policy you can use, do what Jim did and get in touch with an organisation that has been providing this type of help for over 25 years, CCPAS. The Church's Child Protection Advisory Service helps all types of organisations and faith groups with training and setting up and managing safeguarding policies. They also carry out criminal records checks, and they have many resources available for organisations of every size and whatever their financial situation. The reporters decided not to pursue their application with Jim as children's workers. It was obvious to them that they would be quickly discovered as the impostors they were, even if they were prepared to be members of the church for 6 months first. In the car, on the way back to the newspaper, they talked about how well the leader had his child protection organised. When they got back to the office, they reported to their editor just how impressed they were. They had discovered that his church not only had a safeguarding policy, but that it worked. It had kept them out, even though they'd been convinced that they would find a follow-up story on the Miss X case. All the newspapers, TV and radio stations had received a press release from Jim Stapleford about the fellowship, outlining how much had changed since Annie had been there. Jim had help from the church's Child Protection Advisory Service in writing the press release, and it made their dedication to protecting children very clear. The headlines the following morning read, "Church has learned its lesson. It's now a safe place for children." What would those journalists find if they applied for a job as children's workers at your church? Which of these two headlines would your organisation receive the following morning? "Judge slams the church for negligence and incompetence in failing to alert the proper authorities." "Church has learned its lesson. It's now a safe place for children." Which would you rather have?